From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is Mary Beth Wise, and I work for the Library of Congress National Library Service for the Blind and Physically Handicapped. We administer audio and braille books to individuals throughout the country and the U.S. citizens living abroad. I am very proud to introduce Sheila Miyoshi Jager, who earned her PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago. She is an associate professor and director of East Asian Studies at Oberlin College. She has written extensively on modern and contemporary Korean politics and history, and is the author of several books on Korea and East Asia, including The Politics of Identity, History, Nationalism, and the Prospect for Peace in Post-Cold War East Asia, Narratives of Nation Building in East Asia, A Genealogy of Patriotism, Ruptured Histories, War, Memory, and the Post-Cold War in Asia. Her new book, Brothers at War, The Unending Conflict in Korea, is a military, political, and cultural history of the war seen as spanning from 1945 to the present, and its global impact told from American, North and South Korean, and Chinese perspectives. Please join me in welcoming Sheila Miyoshi Jager.
Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction, and thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for this wonderful crowd, which is a tribute to this festival. So it's my first experience here, and it is a true pleasure to be here. My book is called The Brothers at War, The Unending Conflict in Korea, which was published in July of this year, and which many of you may know is the 60th anniversary of the Korean War armistice. And that date is significant because even though the fighting in Korea stopped in 1953, the war continued. No peace treaty was ever signed at the conclusion of the fighting, so the Korean War is in effect a war without end. Now, anyone in Washington predicting some 60 years ago that US troops President Truman sent to Korea in July 1950 would still be there in September 2013 would have been laughed out of town. Truman himself would have dismissed the idea as entirely preposterous. In fact, the Korean police action, as it was called back then, was supposed to be a very brief affair. Most people thought it would be over in a matter of weeks. Once the North Koreans realized that they were fighting Americans and not South Koreans, so everyone thought, they would run back north of the 38th parallel. This did not happen, of course. More than 6 decades later, the Korean Peninsula has remained roughly divided where the conflict has begun. And the DMZ that separates North and South Korea is the most heavily fortified border in the world. Since the late 19th century, the Korean Peninsula has been the point of confrontation among the great powers. First China, Japan, Russia, and then the United States in succession exerted some form of control over the Korean Peninsula. The end of the Second World War, however, left only 2 great powers vying for influence over Korea, the United States and the Soviet Union, which divided the Korean Peninsula at the 38th parallel. But by then, the Korean people had already divided themselves into partisan camps under the tutelage and with the support of these 2 superpower patrons. 2 antagonistic regimes were born, communists in the north and conservatives in the south, each with dreams for unifying the Korean Peninsula under their own rule, but without any means of achieving this on their own. Now, it's commonly believed that the Korean War started on June 25th, 1950, but this is actually not quite true because even before Kim Il-sung launched his invasion of South Korea with Stalin's backing, Koreans had been fighting a bloody civil war for nearly 2 years. The division of the peninsula at the 38th parallel gave rise to fractured polity, whose political fault lines were exacerbated by regional, religious, Christian versus communist, and class divisions. Between 1948 and 1950, nearly 100,000 people perished during this bloody conflict, many of them innocent civilians caught up in the fighting, as leftist guerrillas in the South tried to topple the South Korean regime headed by Syngman Rhee. These Southern leftists were supported by the communists in the North. And when it became clear by the spring of 1950, however, that South Korean regime could not be toppled from within, Kim Il-sung approached Stalin. He wanted the Soviet dictator's support to invade South Korea in order to unify the peninsula under his rule. The attack will be swift and the war will be over in 3 days, Kim assured the Soviet dictator. Stalin's motivations for backing Kim Il-sung's invasion plans are unclear, but what is certain is that neither Kim Il-sung or Stalin believed the United States would intervene in Korea. But of course, both Stalin and Kim were sorely mistaken. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel south on June 25, 1950, the U.S., under a UN mandate, did intervene. And this is because Truman immediately saw Stalin's hand in the North Korean invasion. Kim's quest to unify the peninsula under his own control was now viewed in the context of the Cold War. Within days of the North Korean invasion, America's involvement in the war had made Korea's civil war global. In July 1950, Truman ordered American troops to South Korea in order to stop the North Korean onslaught. In late October in 1950, when the tide of the war had changed after the Incheon landing in September, China entered the war. By the end of 1950, 10 nations had sent ground troops, combat troops, to join the Americans and the Koreans. Never before in modern history had so many nations committed themselves to a common political and military endeavor as they did during the Korean War. The flow of campaigns and battles from the late 1950s to 1951 under constant reorganization led to a complex mix of nationalities which posed formidable challenges. Language barriers were one such challenge. Greek, Turkish, Thai, French, Spanish, Dutch, as well as a number of other dialects were among the tongues used in the UN ground combat units. Although language barriers were never completely overcome, English was the lingua franca, and the burden of translation was left to UN units that provided English-speaking personnel to translate materials, operations and orders, supply instructions into their own language. Feeding the troops provided another significant challenge. The Turks were Muslim, and they were forbidden to eat pork. The Greeks could not eat corn, carrots, or asparagus, and required olive oil for cooking. The Indians were mostly vegetarians. The Filipinos required additional rice, while the Belgian, French, and Dutch consumed greater quantities of bread and potatoes than the Americans did. Clothing also produced a share of difficulties. The Thai, Filipino, and Greek soldiers required smaller clothing. But the most critical area, weapons and ammunition, was not a major problem, however, because as most UN troops, except for the Commonwealth units, were given American arms. But the greatest challenge of the coalition was integrating the Korean War into the U.S. Eighth Army. By the summer of 1951, over 200,000 South Korean soldiers and laborers became part of the Eighth Army. Thus, calling the Eighth Army a U.S. Army was a significant misnomer by the summer of 1951. More appropriate would be UN Army in Korea, since less than half of its 500,000 men was actually Americans. For most countries that sent military forces to Korea, it was the first time in their history to participate in a war not for conquest, occupation, or defense of colonial territory. Rather, the war was seen as the test for the young United Nations and the concept of collective security it was supposed to uphold. But idealistic ideology did not mask the brutality of the fighting. Because the Civil War in Korea never really ended, but simply merged with what we now know as the Korean War, the violence of the fighting took a level of viciousness that was different, I think, than any other war Americans had thus far experienced. One of the worst atrocities occurred in the outskirts of the city of Daejeon. The official U.S. history of the war describes what happened at Daejeon as one of the greatest mass killings of the entire Korean War, estimating that 5,000 to 7,000 civilians were slaughtered by the North Korean People's Army. Many witnesses later described the horror of what they saw when they entered the city. Yoon Jun-young, a former South Korean guard, recalled, "I entered the prison and walked around and discovered the corpses. They were black and covered with flies. I was speechless. I couldn't believe how cruelly those civilians were killed. I mobilized 300 to 400 people to clear up the bodies. It took me 3 days to do it. At first I thought of burying them individually, but there were just so many bodies, we buried them in groups, in larger holes. I don't have an exact count, but it was between 400 to 500 people." The discovery of mass murder solidified in the minds of Americans and others that they were dealing with a quote-unquote unnatural enemy, one who had no regard for human life. But it turns out that the South Koreans could be just as brutal. Right before Daejeon fell to the communists in July 1950, South Korean forces were faced with the dilemma of what to do with the thousands of suspected communists they had imprisoned before the invasion began. They were imprisoned for petty crimes, but in the rush to abandon the city before the communists took it over, all of the prisoners were executed due to fear that they might later join up with the North Korean People's Army. One South Korean soldier later wrote about the incident, "I don't regret the killing of communists who were convicted and sentenced to death, but the others, I wonder what kind of people led our nation who allowed them to be executed as well." When the city was retaken by UN forces in October 1950, victims of the earlier massacre perpetrated by South Korean forces were conflated with the victims of the later North Korean killings. Buried beneath the story of the North Korean massacre, quite literally as it turns out, was the forgotten story of the South Korean carnage. The tides of cruelty continued with the tides of war as North and South Koreans tried to outdo each other in eliminating suspected collaborators from the other side. As the front line moved north and south, the American people were appalled. By the time the war stalemated along the 38th parallel during the summer of 1951, when armistice talks began, the majority of Americans had turned firmly against the war. Now, it's important to keep in mind that although we now see the Korean War as a victory, mostly because we know what South Korea became, and we also know what North Korea became, and we have the Korean War Veterans Memorial right here in DC to commemorate that victory, the Korean War was actually an extremely unpopular war by the time the fighting ended in 1953. Certainly no one could have ever imagined that South Korea could go on to become the economic, political, and cultural powerhouse that it is today, and that the sacrifices made on behalf of this beleaguered nation would have paid off so handsomely. While there were no organized protests against the Korean War like there were against the war in Vietnam, it was extremely unpopular nonetheless. So how did Americans vent their anger and frustration? One way was to openly question the legitimacy of the war itself. Donna Cooper of Memphis, Tennessee, for example, returned a Purple Heart awarded to her fallen son, Paul Cooper, bitterly writing to President Truman in October 1951, quote, "To me, my son is a symbol of the 109,000 men who have been sacrificed in this needless slaughter, a so-called police action that has not and could never be satisfactorily explained to patriotic Americans." Paisley McGovern of Washington, D.C. took an even more drastic action. He refused to accept the posthumously awarded Medal of Honor, and Silver Star on behalf of his two sons, Robert and Jerome, respectively, who died within days of each other, because he said Truman was, quote, unworthy to confer the nation's highest award for valor on his son or any other American son. From these dramatic actions, stories all published in the national and local newspapers at the time, one gets a sense of just how fed up the Americans were with the war. It was also the main reason why Truman decided not to seek a second term. Truman's approval rating sunk to a mere 22% in February 1952, and Eisenhower's landslide victory election was largely due because he promised to end the fighting in Korea, which he did. Eisenhower once said he considered the armistice to be one of the greatest accomplishments of his presidency. Yet, although he stopped the killing, he did not end the war. And this is because the armistice did not resolve the fundamental problem that had precipitated Kim Il-sung's invasion of South Korea in the first place. The nation remained divided. To this day, no peace treaty has ever been signed between the belligerents to bring the war to an end. What followed instead was a long and simmering confrontation between North and South Korea that took a form of a contest of legitimacy, a brothers' war between two implacable regimes, each holding half of the peninsula and each claiming to be simply Korea. Which Korea would become the legitimate Korea? As surprising as it might sound today, the answer at first appeared to be the North. It had been able to rapidly rebuild after the war with the generous help of its communist backers. It had bigger industries and better roads, and its people were better fed. Its gross domestic per capita was twice that of the South. In fact, North Korea attracted so much attention as a modelist socialist state in the early 1960s that many wealthy Korean families living in Japan decided to return to the socialist fatherland. Nevertheless, there were signs that the North's ascendancy could not be maintained. By the late 1960s, production rates began to slow, fueled by the internal deficiencies of the Stalinist system. The number of incidences along the DMZ also underwent a dramatic intensification during this period, as Kim Il-sung realized that the window for achieving reunification under his control was rapidly closing. But since neither the Soviet Union nor China, for that matter, supported another war on the Korean peninsula, they were very careful to keep Kim Il-sung in check. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev was not about to repeat Stalin's mistake. By the 1970s, it was clear which Korea would come out on top, thanks largely to the export-oriented growth strategy of South Korea's President Park Chung-hee. The South's economy began to rapidly take off. It was called the Big Push. One story goes that Park Chung-hee heard there was a global demand for ocean-going tankers. He summoned Chung Ju-young, the founder of Hyundai, and told him to start building ships. Chung flew to Greece, where he landed 2 contracts for 260,000-ton oil tankers by offering cheaper prices and quicker delivery than his competitors. Chung didn't seem too concerned by the fact that South Korea had no shipyards to build the ships. He simply solved this problem by showing the 2 orders to Barclays Bank in London, which lent him enough capital to build them. But no Korean knew how to do this. Again, Chung was undeterred. He sent 60 engineers to Scotland to learn how. Both ships were finished and delivered before the deadline and under cost. And today, South Korea is the largest shipbuilding nation in the world. When the industrial giants of the 20th century are lined up, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, Kiichiro Toyoda, a Korean captain of industry, will be among them. By the 1990s, it was clear which Korea had won the war, as the contrast between the 2 states could not have been starker. One was a regional power, prosperous, democratic, with a growing international reputation. The 1988 Seoul Olympics vividly showcased to billions around the world that South Korea was no longer the poverty-stricken war victim of the past, but a vibrant, rich, and modern society. The other Korea had become an aid-dependent nation racked by poverty, isolation, and repression. The demise of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia and China's abandonment of the friendship price system and demand for hard currency for exports resulted in a steep decline in the North Korean economy. A series of floods and North Korea's agricultural practices added to Pyongyang's misfortune. The result was a famine on a massive scale in which an estimated 2 million of its people perished from starvation. The contest for Korean legitimacy was over. The South had won the war. There is only one nation on earth that does not see it that way. And today, the reversal in the fortunes of the two countries, South Korea's prosperity, democracy, and cultural power, see next to the calamity of the Kim dynasty's unrealized utopia, is what explains the fury of North Korea's predicament and its extraordinary refusal to open up to the rest of the world. To enact vital reforms that might improve the lives of its citizens would also mean exposing them to what has happened to their brothers just south of the DMZ. And the more North Koreans know about the South, the less likely they are to put up with the conditions of poverty and repression at home. And this is what the North Korean regime fears most. South of the border, however, the end of the legitimacy contest has had different effects, often manifested in a surprising lack of concern about the North's dangerous-sounding bluster. The streets and alleys of Gangnam and Myeongdong, South Korea's premier shopping districts, bustled with carefree shoppers the day Pyongyang threatened to launch a nuclear strike against Seoul this past March. Such seeming indifference to Pyongyang's threats, and indeed to North Korea itself, extends to South Koreans' interest in reunification. In the 1990s, more than 80% of South Koreans believed that unification was a vital national goal. Today, just 1 in 5 South Korean teenagers believe unification is imperative, a fraction of those who believe this in their parents' and grandparents' generations. But north of them live 23 million people, still under threat of starvation and imprisonment, ruled by a totalitarian regime that has threatened to become a rogue nuclear power. And since North Korean leaders know that the major security threat to their hold on power is internal, not external, it is the uncensored flow of information directly to the North Korean people which they fear most. So how will the Korean War finally end? I think the answer will largely depend on whether Pyongyang's leaders can swallow their pride, admit defeat, and embark upon a path of incremental reforms carefully buttressed and shielded by China. This will be the real test of the Kim Jong-un regime, the key to stability and peace in Northeast Asia, and the final resolution of the long, damaging endgame of the Korean War. In the meantime, however, we must never forget that the remaining victims of the Korean War are the North Korean people who continue to suffer to silence in this day. It is they who have borne the brunt of this unresolved conflict, starved and ignored these past 60 years. While the rest of the world has moved on from the war, celebrating our triumph with memorials and tributes, it is the North Korean people who continue to endure the unendurable. I'd like to end this talk with a short poem by Chang Chin-sung, once a senior North Korean propaganda official who defected to the South in 2004. The poem is called The Executioner. Whenever people are gathered, there are gunshots to be heard. Today, as the crowd looks on, a man is executed. You are not to feel any sympathy. Even when he's dead, we must kill him again. The loudspeaker's words are interrupted. Bang, bang. The rest of the message is delivered. Why is it that today the crowd is silent? His crime, to steal a bag of rice. His sentence, 90 bullets in his heart. His occupation, farmer. Thank you. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Professor Jager, I'm going to ask you a political question because you're a chairman of the East Asian program. In the early 1950s, not only was the United States at war with the Koreans, but the French down the road were at war with the Vietnamese. Now, Atchison, Truman threw a lot of money, a lot of supplies, a lot of guns to that effort. Why was it that we did not fight Vietnam or the world, but we went into Korea? I mean, pretend you were in the White House and deciding what strategy to take.
Why the United States didn't? Why we decided to fight Korea? I mean, it was basically because the North Koreans invaded South Korea on June 25th, 1950. I mean, and it was at that point, after the North Korean invasion, that when we were fighting North Koreans, that's when we actually stepped up and began to supply the French in Indochina, right? So the two events actually are connected.
Because when Eisenhower came, yes, he did end the Korean War, but he did provide continuous arms and people into Vietnam. So it was like two sister wars going on.
Well, I mean, that's kind of interesting because the Korean War ended in '53, right? And then there was the Great Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And this is when the French were going to lose in Indochina, right? And it was at that point when the French basically asked the Americans, are you going to help us in Indochina? And Eisenhower quite wisely said no, that they were not going to help the French. And they were going to allow the North Vietnamese to take over. And the reason for that was because they just ended the Korean War. It was extremely unpopular, right? And he did not believe that the American people would support another war in Asia. But interestingly, 10 years later, when Johnson was faced with a similar problem, whether or not to intervene in Vietnam, the Korean War took on a very different view. I mean, actually, by 1965, the Korean War was viewed sort of as a victory. We had, after all, stopped communism in Asia. And it was the Korean War analogy that largely informed, actually, Johnson's decision to send troops in March 1965.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
May I?
Yeah.
First, I did spend military time in Korea. Now, this was 50 years ago, not 60. And I've always been interested in the view from your side as to what you think the Chinese goal is. At this point in time, obviously, the North Koreans are still developing nuclear, they're still developing rockets, they still have a very, very soft economic base. And my view is, if you take away the Chinese support, it will collapse. What is in it as seen by the Chinese?
Well, I think very simply the Chinese want stability and the status quo. If they do not support the North Korean regime, basically you'll have 23 million starving people and flooding their borders. So it's to their advantage to continue to keep the status quo in North Korea, simply to maintain stability and peace. But I should say that also that the United States, South Korea, Russia, all the regional powers don't want a significant regime collapse because it would be just too destabilizing for the region. So that, I mean, that simply put, that's the reason why China continues to support North Korea.
It's a strange way to maintain stability.
Well, it's worked for the last 60 years, though. Right?
If you call that stable, yes.
Well, that's true. Well, at least there's not a shooting war or anything, but...
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. I have two questions. First, you said earlier that in the immediate aftermath of the Korean War in the late 50s and 60s, North Korea actually looked like it would be the more successful of the two Koreas. That it was built up more to seemingly repair the damage of the war more thoroughly than the South had. So my first question is, to what extent do you think that was actually just propaganda? Like, just it was very common for the communist countries during the Cold War to do Potemkin Village-style propaganda, where they'd only show the outside world what had been fixed up and repaired, and they would just not let them see the other 90% of the country. So to what extent was it true, and to what extent was it fabricated?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, but I think they actually did back then, in the 1950s, they actually stopped in the mid-60s keeping economic records. So we do know that it was a lot better off than it is, for example, today. And North Korea was actually viewed as a model socialist state. I mean, it can't be just fantasy that why a lot of Korean families in Japan, for example, decided to come to North Korea, because they saw it as a land of opportunity. I mean, there is hard evidence that the North Koreans were actually economically ahead of the South until really the mid-1960s.
I have a second question.
Sure.
You also talked about the recent survey of South Korean teenagers where they said that they didn't really care about reunification. To what extent do you think attitudes in that generation might change as they get older?
You mean how the younger generation might later think about unification?
Yes, as they get older.
I think the younger generation basically are not interested in unification, which means probably, if the democrats continue, a permanent division of the Korean Peninsula. I don't think that there is the will anymore of the South Korean people to sacrifice for unification.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Hi.
Thank you. As you know, South Korea has a woman president for the first time in its history, and of course she has a legacy in that her father held that role before her. I wonder if you have any impressions or insights or thoughts about whether having a woman in that kind of leadership role makes any difference, or is it, same thing, different day?
I mean, being a woman in a conservative society, well, it's Park Geun-hye, the current president, probably could not have been president without her father, who is, the person I talked about, Park Chung-hee. So more than being a woman, she is the legacy of Park Chung-hee, right? So I'm not quite sure that it actually changes much the perception. It's her link really to the former president who really laid the groundwork for South Korea's miracle that gave her the platform to become president. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I've been reading some of the stories from those that have escaped North Korea, and horrifying stories where it sounds like the very social, personal relationships that basically are the glue of a society have been destroyed, and you have a whole generation without that framework. And I'm just curious on your thoughts, is that anywhere being thought about, discussed, in consideration if there's ever any change within North Korea, or if there is ever unification, what that would mean when you have such different cultures now, it sounds like, with and without the ties that bind people together.
Yeah, well, a lot of people say that North and South Korea are so, not only economically so different, but culturally, socially, they're basically disparate nations, that unification, if it were ever to happen, it would be tremendously difficult to overcome that. And the longer, of course, that the division continues, the harder it is to ever bring back together. So a lot of people say, because of the divergence of the two cultures and the two sort of societies, the prospect of unification becomes dimmer, dimmer, and dimmer. Yeah.
In your reference to the Eisenhower presidency and then jumping to the Johnson presidency, weren't the seeds of Vietnam planted during the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations?
Well, in the context of the Cold War, yes, they definitely were. I mean, it was when we decided to get involved in Korea in 1950 that we started to fund the French, right? So our involvement in Indochina became that much more involved at that period. So of course, there was a correlation between our involvement in Korea as well as in Vietnam, because we're fighting basically the communist enemy, right?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, good afternoon. I enjoyed your speech.
Thank you.
Is there any information that the North Korean people are getting, or is it a total news blackout? And what does the West do about getting information into the North to plant some seeds about, what's going on in the rest of the world?
Well, there is indications that, for example, in Pyongyang, which is the capital of North Korea, there is information that comes obviously through China and other sources. It's not clear about the rest of the country how informed that they are. But Pyongyang is a kind of showcase city. Only 15% of what they call the core class of North Koreans, that is the elite of the elite, live in Pyongyang. So they're the most reliable political class. And so information does flow slightly into Pyongyang, but whether it reaches the other 85% of the people is not clear. It has not.
Are the Chinese interested in moderating the North Korean government? I know they want to keep the status quo.
Yes, I mean, of course, it's for China's benefit that North Korea it doesn't want to continue to support North Korea indefinitely. So it does want North Korea to reform incrementally, but without destabilizing the regime so much that it would collapse. Right. So China right now is investing a huge amount of money and resources in trying to develop North Korean industries, for example, in the far northeast areas. But it's a kind of controlled, incremental investment, right? It doesn't want North Korea to open up too quickly in order to be destabilizing, but it still wants some reforms so that it can incrementally reform itself.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Your talk is very interesting. Between 1980 and 2001, as an architect, I had the opportunity to be in South Korea and watch that transformation that you talked about. Mm-hmm. One of the things that was said to me over and over was that after the war, after the conflict, and through that 70 period, 80 period, the great migration from the north of men and women who were both influential in the industrial might of North Korea, then North Korea, and financially capable to do that, migrated down. And
well, I wouldn't say migrated, because that looks like a lot of people. It was defected.
Defected
right,
down.
Right.
Moved down.
Moved down. Well, a trickle at a time. Right.
It took a... So how much has that played into the success of South Korea? And the second question builds on what was said and what was asked earlier. Since that generation has become my generation, we've gotten older, right, and those younger kids are not part of that, having moved down or migrated down or be dislocated, does that influence their lack of interest in unification?
Well, when you talk about migrating, you're talking about right after the war, or after the division in 30 and 45, right?
Yes.
And you're not talking about later.
45 and through the Korean conflict.
Yeah. And the question is how the North Koreans contributed to South Korean economy after that migration.
Right.
Yeah, actually, many of the great industrialists, Chun Ji-young is one example, is a North Korean. Many of the North Korean industrialists who built up South Korea were actually from North Korea. Paek Sun-yup, who's a great, one of the great generals that led the success in the Korean War, was also from North Korea. So yes, many of them contributed highly to South Korean society. I'm sorry, what was your second
Well,
question?
the second part of that is, with that aging heritage, this younger generation might not have the link to North Korea that their parents or their grandparents did.
Right. So it's precisely because there is no link and no real memory, and they grew up with this division, that I don't think that, my personal opinion, that is probably unification will not happen. Yes, I don't think it will. I don't think that the South Korean people, the younger generation, are interested enough for them to make any kind of sacrifices that it will.
Well, thank you very much.
Afternoon.
Hi.
Thank you.
I can only take one more question, right? Okay, I got 2 more questions. Okay, go ahead.
I wonder if you care to share anything, or if you could share on prior to Kim Il-sung's invasion in Korea, before the invasion. Thanks.
What aspect?
I don't. Yeah. What led up to the invasion? Well, what was the economic conditions?
Well, I mean,
it's a broad question, I know.
It is kind of a broad question. Well, Kim Il-sung obviously felt confident enough to be able to win the war, right? Which is one of the reasons why he was so intent on it. Right after the division in 1945, actually North Korea, the Russians came in, and they were very quickly able to create a stable regime. The South Koreans had the Americans in the South had a much greater difficulty. There was a lot of chaos, civil war, and instability. And so Kim Il-sung, when he saw the situation, he actually believed, when he invaded the South, that the South Korean people were going to welcome his troops as liberators. He believed that 200,000 South Korean guerrillas were going to rise up and overthrow the Syngman regime. So there was this perception that he was the legitimate Korea, and that was really what the war was about, and that the invasion wasn't really an invasion; it was a liberation of the South by the true North Korean leader Kim Il-sung. And of course, that perception did not prove correct. Right? One more question. So one more question.
After Mao's defeat of Chiang Kai-shek in '49, as I recall,
yes,
there was a great debate in America about who lost China.
Right.
And after that debate took hold, no administration, Republican or Democrat, could be seen as soft on communist, what we perceived as communist aggression, which led, in my opinion, directly to the Vietnamese War. Mm-hmm. But that must have had a part in Korea in 1950.
Right. Well, so to bring back to the background, in 1949, the Chinese communist, the CCP took over. And there was a debate within the American foreign policy community whether or not they should embrace communist China or distance themselves from communist China, right? But of course, after the North Koreans invaded, that whole debate about going towards China ceased, right? And the Chinese came into the war, and we basically, after the Korean War for 20 years, we didn't have any relationship with China until 1972, right, when Nixon went to China. So not only did the Korean War create a permanent division of the Korean Peninsula, it created a permanent conflict, well, not a permanent conflict, but a 20-year conflict between the United States and China. It froze our relationship, basically, for 20 years. Yeah. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.